President of America, Donald Trump, says India agreed to stop buying Russian oil and commit to $500 billion in American purchases. Prime Minister Modi thanked Trump for reducing tariffs, but said nothing about Russian oil, nothing about $500 billion. Oil markets, they barely moved. Trade experts, they're calling it anywhere from hard to believe to a potential nothing burger. So, what's actually in this deal? Is this the breakthrough that resets US-India relations and helps end the war in Ukraine like how Trump claims? Or is this political theater with some tariff relief attached? Because here's what's fascinating. When you look at what both leaders actually said, when you talk to experts, when you check the data, the gap between the headlines and the reality is enormous. And that gap tells us everything about how international trade actually works in 2026.
You're listening to Nelson John 360. Nelson John 360.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Nelson John 360. I'm Nelson John, and today we are diving deep into a trade deal that's making headlines around the world. The India-US agreement announced just yesterday. Now, you've probably seen the big numbers flying around. $500 billion in purchases, 18% tariffs. India stopped buying Russian oil. Now, that sounds massive. And this is exactly what I try to do on this show. Try to go beyond those headline numbers and try and understand what actually is happening here. Because when you start peeling back the layers on this deal, you'll find something fascinating. What President Trump is claiming and what Prime Minister Modi is saying don't quite match up. And that gap between those narratives tell us a lot about the state of global trade, geopolitics, and the complex dance happening between the world's oldest democracy and its largest. So let me break this down. We're going to look at how we got here and what was actually agreed to, what the experts are skeptical about, and most importantly, what this really means for the India-US relationship going forward. Now, to understand this deal, let's rewind back to say about a year ago. See, during Trump's first term back in 2017, 2021, the US and India were already butting heads on trade. They tried to negotiate what they called a mini trade deal, multiple rounds of talks between 2018 and 19, but they fell apart. Why? The usual suspects: agriculture, digital taxes, tariffs. India wanted access to US market, and the US wanted India to open up its agricultural sector. Neither sides would budge. Fast forward to Trump's second term, and things got complicated. Here's what happened. Russia invades Ukraine in 2022. The Western countries slap sanctions on Russia. Russian oil becomes cheap. I mean, really cheap, because fewer countries are willing to buy it. And India sees an opportunity. They start importing massive amounts of Russian oil. We're talking about 1.5 million barrels per day by 2025. Now, that's more than a third of India's total oil imports. From India's perspective, this makes perfect economic sense. They're getting oil at a significant discount, about $16 per barrel cheaper than OPEC or US crude. Now, for a country of 1.4 billion people trying to fuel economic growth, that's billions of dollars in savings. But from Washington's perspective, that's a massive problem. Here, the US is trying to economically isolate Russia, trying to end the war in Ukraine by cutting off Putin's revenue streams. And one of the key strategic partners, a country they're counting on to balance China's rise, is essentially bankrolling the Russian war machine. So last July, Trump started turning the screws. First came a 25% reciprocal tariff on Indian goods. His argument: India charges high tariffs on American products, while enjoying relatively low tariffs to access the US market. That's not fair. So we're going to reciprocate. Then in August, he goes further, another 25% tariff. This one specifically as punishment for buying Russian oil. So the Indian exporters were facing a collective of 50% tariffs to sell goods to the United States. That's enormous. For context, those are some of the highest tariffs Trump imposed on any country. And India's export sector, they're hurting. The US is India's largest export market. In 2025, the US imported about $95.5 billion worth of goods from India: pharmaceuticals, textiles, electronics, chemicals. Suddenly, all of that is 50% more expensive for American buyers. India tried to find workarounds. They accelerated trade talks with other partners. More on that in a minute. They allowed more cooperation from China, ironically. But at the end of the day, you can't easily replace the US market. Meanwhile, the relationship between these two countries, which had been one of the bright spots in US foreign policy, a strategic partnership to counter China, was deteriorating fast. By late 2025, experts are calling it the lowest point in decades. So that brings us to Monday, February 2nd, 2026. Donald Trump gets on Truth Social, his preferred platform for major announcements, and drops what he calls a trade deal with India. And the way he frames it is pretty striking. Listen to how this was positioned. He starts by saying he had an honor to speak with Prime Minister Modi, calling him one of my greatest friends and a powerful and respected leader. There's clearly an effort here to smooth over months of tension. Then he lays out what he says was agreed to. Let me read it out. First, on Russian oil. Trump claims Modi agreed to stop buying Russian oil and to buy more from the United States and potentially Venezuela. He even connects this to ending the war in Ukraine, saying it will help end the war in Ukraine, which is taking place right now with thousands of people dying each and every week. Second, on tariffs. The United States will immediately reduce its tariff on Indian goods from 25 to 18%. But here's a key detail that Trump's initial post understated. The White House later confirmed they also are dropping the additional 25% penalty tariff on Russian oil purchases. So the total tariff is actually dropped from 50 to 18%. That's a massive reduction. In exchange, Trump says India will reduce their tariffs on non-tariff barriers against the United States to zero. Yes, zero. That would be huge if true. Third, the big number. Trump claims Modi committed to buy American at a much higher level, in addition to over $500 billion of US energy, technology, agriculture, coal, and many other products. $500 billion. That's with a B. That's an enormous figure. To put that in context, total US goods exports to India in 2025 were about $42 billion. Trump here is claiming India just committed to buying more than 10 times that amount. Now, here's where it gets interesting. About an hour later, Prime Minister Modi posts his response on X. That's formerly Twitter, yeah. And what he says there is, quoting him, "Wonderful to speak with my dear friend, President Trump today. Delighted that Made in India products will now have a reduced tariff of 18%. Big thanks to President Trump on behalf of the 1.4 billion people of India for this wonderful announcement." He talks about cooperation, partnership, peace, stability. Very diplomatic, very positive. But notice what Modi doesn't mention. Nothing about Russian oil. Nothing about the $500 billion. Nothing about reducing Indian tariffs to zero. That's a pretty glaring omission, don't you think? Let me start with what might be the most geopolitically significant claim here, that India has agreed to stop buying Russian oil. If it's true, that's going to be massive. We're talking about cutting off a major revenue stream for Russia's war effort. But here's why experts are skeptical. First, the economic reality, all right? India has been importing 1.5 million barrels of Russian oil every single day. That's not just a big number. It represents over a third of India's total oil imports. And they're getting it all at a steal of a price because of the sanctions. Now, could India replace all that oil, Russian oil, with American and Venezuelan crude? Technically, maybe, but there are problems. US oil is light and sweet. What I mean by that is, it's different quality than the heavy, sour Russian crude that Indian refiners are set to process. Venezuelan oil is more similar to Russian oil in quality, but here's the thing. Venezuela's oil infrastructure is in terrible shape. It would take years, maybe even decades to ramp up production to the level that India would need. Second, looking at the financial reality here, all right? Even as oil prices have come down recently, Russian crude still trades at about $16 per barrel discounted compared to that of the US or OPEC oil. Now, for a country importing 1.5 million barrels a day, that discount represents billions of dollars in annual savings. India's economy is growing. Energy demand is surging. Walking away from that kind of savings is going to be a huge risk. Also, we need to look at another angle, that is the strategic reality. Russia isn't just an oil supplier to India. We can all agree upon that. They're one of India's oldest and closest partners. Russia supplies about 60 to 70% of India's military equipment. When India needs backup at the UN Security Council, Russia often provides it. This is a relationship, that goes way back to the Cold War era, when the US was aligned with Pakistan and the Soviet Union was India's key supporter. Is India really going to completely cut off Russian oil, potentially damaging that broader strategic relationship, or just to get tariffs reduced? According to Robert Yauger, an analyst at Mizuho Securities, he put it out bluntly. Even after this agreement, he expects India may continue buying Russian oil through what he called the dark fleet. Ships that use murky tactics to transport sanctioned oil. As he said, there's been a zillion different ways they've been able to outflank sanctioned authorities. They'll find a way to go dark fleet and get those barrels moved. That's not exactly confidence inspiring, right? If you're counting on the deal to cut Russian revenue. Here are some counterpoints that I'd like to bring about. India has actually been reducing its Russian oil imports since November 2025, when the US implemented new sanctions on Russia. It's not that India stopped it entirely, but the trend was downward. And India recently signed a natural gas deal with the US. They're also increasing oil imports from America. So the shift was already beginning, just not as dramatically or completely as Trump is claiming. The Atlantic Council's analysis is telling. They note that India is highly unlikely to stop buying cheap oil from Russia, one of its closest partners. But the recent reductions, combined with new US energy deals, likely addresses US concerns and helped the two sides to get to the finish line. In other words, it might be more about India showing enough progress to give Trump a face-saving way to reduce tariffs, rather than an absolute commitment to zero Russian oil. And here's the kicker. There's no verification mechanism that's been announced. No monitoring, no enforcement. If India does backslide on Russian oil imports in a few months, what happens? Does the 50% tariff come back? We don't know, because there's no formal agreement text released yet. Now, let me talk about that other eye popping number, $500 billion in Indian purchases of American goods. Again, context matters here. In 2025, India imported, say, about $42 billion in goods from the United States. Now, Trump is claiming Modi just committed to buying $500 billion worth of stuff. Like I mentioned before, energy, technology, agriculture, coal, and more. But here are some of the problems that I see. No time frame. Is that $500 billion over 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20? Trump's post doesn't say. Modi's post doesn't mention it at all. During Modi's visit to Washington back in 2025, the two countries set a goal to boost bilateral trade to $500 billion by 2030. Note, that's total bilateral trade, both directions combined. Currently, two-way trade is around $191 billion. So they were talking about more than doubling trade flows over 5 years, with both countries buying more from each other. Is Trump's $500 billion figure just a repackaging of that existing 2030 goal? Or is this something new and additional? Well, at least at this point in time, it's currently unknown. The second problem is that there are no binding mechanisms. This appears to be a political commitment, not a legal obligation. The Indian government, just can't order Indian companies to buy $500 billion worth of American products. That's not how trade works in market economies. Companies buy what makes economic sense for them. Sure, the government can facilitate deals, maybe coordinate some high ticket purchases in energy or defense. But $500 billion? That would require Indian businesses to cross multiple sectors to dramatically shift their sourcing towards American suppliers, often at potentially higher costs than alternatives from China, Europe, or domestic production. Another consistent problem that I've seen lingering around is the agriculture claim. Trump significantly mentioned about agriculture as part of that $500 billion deal. But here's the thing. Agriculture has been a complete red line for India in every trade negotiation. According to analysis from Richard Rosso at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, India kept its stance that agriculture is a no-go through these negotiations. India protects its farmers fiercely. There are political and food security reasons for this. The idea that India suddenly agreed to massive agricultural imports as part of this deal, well, it seems unlikely. Rousseau's analysis also suggests that staple grains grown in India were likely excluded from the market access that the US was seeking. So, when Trump says $500 billion including agriculture, either he's talking about non-staple agricultural products or that claim is more aspirational than actual. So what was actually agreed to then? If the Russian oil commitment is questionable and the $500 billion figure is vague, what did they actually agree to? Here's what we know for certain. The White House has confirmed this. The US tariff reduction is real and immediate. Tariffs on Indian goods dropped from 50% to 18% effective immediately. That's a concrete, verifiable change. Indian exporters in pharmaceuticals, textiles, electronics, and other sectors can breathe a sign of relief. Now, for India, this is huge. The 50% tariffs, they were crushing. Some Indian exporters were losing market share to competitors in Vietnam and China who faced lower tariffs. This reduction puts Indian products back in the game. Also, both sides agreed to continue negotiating. This appears to be what they're calling a first phase of a more comprehensive trade agreement. The Atlantic Council describes it as the first phase of a more comprehensive bilateral trade agreement. I would say think about it as a confidence-building measure. Now, after months of deteriorating relations, both sides need a win. This gives them that political cover to keep talking. India might have likely committed to some increase in US imports, particularly energy. Even though the $500 billion figure seems aspirational, there was probably some commitment to increase purchases of US natural gas and oil. India has been diversifying its energy sources anyways. This just formalizes and accelerates that. There's also probably some agreement on reducing certain Indian tariffs on non-tariff barriers. That is, even if it's not zero across the board, as Trump claimed, India likely agreed to reduce barriers in specific sectors. We don't know which ones yet because there's no formal text released. And that's really the key point here. Yep. There's no formal agreement text. Everything we know comes from social media posts and background briefings. Until we see an actual document with specific commitments, timelines, and enforcement mechanisms, a lot of this remains in the realm of political promises rather than binding obligations. So, what's really going on here? Why this deal? Why now? To understand that, we need to look at the broader geopolitical chessboard. First, the EU factor. Just 1 week before Trump's announcement, India and the European Union concluded negotiations on a massive free trade agreement. The EU, they called it the mother of all deals. I talk about that in detail in my last episode. Do check it out. Now, this agreement creates a free trade zone converting 2 billion people. India's 1.4 billion plus EU's 600 million or so. It eliminates most tariffs on goods, covers services, reduces import taxes on European wine, cars going to India, open markets for Indian textiles and pharmaceuticals going to Europe. For Washington, this had to be alarming. Here's your strategic partner, India, pivoting toward Europe at a time when you're trying to isolate China and counter Beijing's influence. If India is getting better market access in Europe, American businesses start losing out. Several analysts noted that the India-EU deal likely lit a fire under US-India negotiations, that Trump could not afford to be left out while Europe was making deals with India. Another thing to watch out for was India's negotiating approach. Here's what was fascinating. Richard Russo pointed out that India handled Trump's pressure completely differently this time compared to Trump's first term. Back in 2017, 2021, when the US hit India with steel and aluminum tariffs and revoked preferential trade agreement, India retaliated with its own tariffs. It turned into what Russo called a medium-intensity trade war. This time, India didn't fight back. India approached the US pressure with a calm head. They put their head down, kept negotiating, and tried to comply. That's sophisticated diplomacy. Instead of escalating, India absorbed the pain, kept channels open, and waited for an opportunity. Meanwhile, they worked on alternatives, the EU deal, a deal with Oman, talks with New Zealand. They were building leverage without confrontation. Also, we need to factor in the personal relationships. Trump nominated Sergio Gore, his personal advisor, as ambassador to India. That's not a career diplomat. That's someone with direct access to Trump. That matters in an administration where personal relationships often trump formal diplomatic channels. And Trump and Modi clearly have a personal rapport. Whatever you think of either leader's policies, right? The language in their statements, dear friend, one of my greatest friends, that's not just diplomatic boilerplate. These are two leaders who've invested in their relationship. Sometimes in international relations, that personal chemistry can unlock deals that formal negotiations can't. Also, we cannot undermine the fact that, both the leaders here need a win. Trump campaigned on ending bad trade deals, and getting tough on countries buying Russian oil. He's been struggling to make progress on ending the Ukraine war. A deal with India, even if parts of it are more symbolic than substantive, gives something to point to. Modi, meanwhile, was facing real economic pain from those 50% tariffs. Indian exporters were screaming. The business community was worried. And with state elections in India and national elections coming up, Modi needed to show he could protect Indian economic interests. So this deal serves both leaders' political needs, even if some of the claims being made about it are, let's say, optimistic. All right, wrapping things up, the gap between Trump's claims and Modi's cautious statements tell you everything you need to know. This is partly about actual trade policy, but it's also about domestic politics, international signaling, and managing a complex relationship between two countries that need each other, even if they don't always agree. Will India actually stop buying Russian oil? Probably not entirely. Though imports may decline further, will India actually buy $500 billion worth of American goods? Not unless that figure is spread over many years and includes a lot of deals that would have happened anyway. Will Indian tariffs actually drop to zero? Almost certainly not across the board, though some reductions in specific sectors are likely. But will this deal help stabilize an important relationship and create space for cooperation on issues that matter to both the countries? That's possible. Maybe that's what actually matters the most here. And as always, the devil is in the details. Details we largely don't have yet. And as always, the reality tends to be more complex, more nuanced, and more interesting than the headlines suggest. That's what we have here today on Nelson John 360. I go beyond those headlines to understand what really is happening and why it matters. Thank you for listening. If you found this insight valuable, please do share it with someone who's trying to understand what's really happening. You can connect with me on Instagram. Just look me up, Nelson John 360. Leave me a message. I'd love to hear from you all. Thank you so much. Stay well informed and stay safe.